Welcome to everyone who's coming in. We're going to be starting very soon, but want to give another minute or so to those who are coming in right now. But we very much appreciate you being here with us, and thank you. And we'll be starting in about 1 minute with the conversation in the panel. Again, welcome everybody. We're going to start in just a few minutes, not a few minutes, a few seconds actually, but I just am trying to let those folks who are, trickling in to be able to get here from the very start, but we're going to start right up in just a few moments. Okay, well, welcome, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to this conversation, to this forum. My name is Paul Raushenbush, and I am the president of Interfaith Alliance. And we are an organization founded almost 30 years ago. We're celebrating 30 years next year. And we were founded to celebrate religious diversity in America, and that people of all faith traditions and no faith traditions might work together to be equally treated under the law and receive equal dignity in our society. And we work on an inclusive religious freedom to that end, as well as protect democracy from extremism of all kinds and those who would use the power of religion to dominate and discriminate rather than celebrate and uplift our neighbors. So I'm glad to welcome you here. I am especially glad to welcome you to today's panel on big tech, hate, and religious freedom online. I want to take one moment to thank my colleague, Ria Coley, who was instrumental in the creation of this panel and the report that we'll be launching today, and you all receive at the end of this webinar. This conversation about religion online, religious freedom online, and hate and big tech is very dear to my heart. I went to seminary in the 90s when the internet was just becoming available. And I was the editor of one of the major first religion websites called BeliefNet. And I really believed in the possibility of the internet for interfaith cooperation, for interfaith understanding, the idea that we could transcend geographical barriers and meet people from very different backgrounds, learn from one another, hold intimate conversation, welcome one another into our sacred spaces and to learn. And I just felt like the possibilities were endless, that this was the greatest invention since the printing press, and even more so that it will radically transform our lives. And I still believe all of that. And yet the negative consequences have become very clear. Humans, whether technology or not, are going to human, and the technology has been used for very dangerous ways. And our ability to understand the internet and to use it in productive ways has not kept up with the technology. We have not been able to understand its implications quickly enough to figure out how to harness this for good. And what we are seeing right now is, the results of that, how people experience being online, that so many people experience hate online, intimidation online. And, just today, as we are having this webinar, a well-known white supremacist and anti-Semite has been welcomed back to Twitter. And so I have a lot to say about that, but this is a perfect opportunity for me to turn to our panelists, because we have an extraordinary panel, and I will thank them so many times. This is the dream team of people who I would love to have a conversation with about this topic, about big tech, about hate, and about religious freedom online. Before I introduce them to you, I just want to say a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to be speaking for about 35 minutes, and then There will be time for questions, and you can start asking them whenever you feel like, using the Q&A button below. We hope to get to as many of those questions as possible. So please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A button. And at the end of our conversation, we will be providing you with a link to the report that Interfaith Alliance is launching today, entitled Big Tech, Hate, and Religious Freedom Online. So let me quickly do introductions to our panel. This is a marvelous group who have long resumes, but I'm going to shorten them for the sake of time, and hope that you can follow up with them where they work. Zaki Barzinji, not Brzezinski, Barzinji. Zaki, tell me what it is.
Barzinji.
Barzinji, thank you.
Barzinski is my Polish alias.
Thank you. Okay, you know, we were joking earlier, with a name like Raushenbush, it should be easy, but thank you for the correction and the correct pronunciation. He is the program director for Aspen Digital, where he oversees a range of projects at the intersection of tech, policy, equity, and justice for unrepresented communities. He served in the White House as Senior Associate Director of Public Engagement and President Obama's liaison to the Arab American, Muslim, Sikh, and other minority faiths, where he worked to amplify voices and narratives seldom represented at the highest levels of government. Welcome, Zaki. Lauren Krapf serves as the Anti-Defamation League's Counsel for Technology, Policy, and Advocacy. Her work includes advocacy to support targets of online harassment and hold social media companies accountable for their role in fomenting extremism, hate, and anti-Semitism and racism. Lauren spearheads ADL's anti-cyber harassment initiative, Backspace Hate. Prior to joining ADL, Lauren worked as a litigate associate in Los Angeles, where she was the co-founder of her firm's harassment and bias intervention training. Paul Barrett is the deputy director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at New York University's Stern School of Business, and he joined the center in the September of 2017 after working for more than 3 decades as a journalist and author, focusing on the intersection of business, law, and society. At the Center for Business and Human Rights, Paul has focused on producing series of reports on the role and obligations of the social media industry in a democracy, including the debate over the liability of social media platforms for harmful content and the role of social media companies in intensifying political polarization in the US. So you can see why I'm excited for this conversation. And I want to invite each of you on this day, waking up this morning, you know, where the internet is right now. What is the most pressing issue facing us today? What would you like to start out with as the thing that you want to be focusing on right now? Lauren, why don't I start with you?
Thank you so much, and thanks to the Interfaith Alliance. I'm really happy to be here and engaging in this conversation today with my fellow panelists. You know, it is tough to pick one thing to focus on when we're talking about online hate and harassment, and certainly extremism as well. The online world is essentially a faster and more connected extension of our physical world. And I think that that is a really important point to revisit again and again, because the actions that happen online do have consequences, both online and offline. People's livelihoods and networks, our identities are increasingly shaped by our ability to function safely online. And that's why ADL is committed to protecting those rights, just as we have protections in the offline world. We don't want individuals to check their rights before going online. You know, in 2017, ADL launched our Center for Technology and Society to take our 100-plus-year-old mission and really focus in what that looks like in the online world to fight hate and extremism, racism, and anti-Semitism. So what's the one thing to focus on? This might be dodging that question, but I think really it's to ensure that there's a whole of society approach to these issues, and that lens of considering the online ramifications and the offline impact of our digital hygiene, of digital abuse, of hate and harassment online, that lens is applied across the board. I think whether it's legislative, education focused, industry, and beyond, we really need that to be a lens applied as opposed to focusing on one particular issue. So really happy to be here and engage in that conversation. And at the end of the day, we want individuals to be able to operate safely and freely online. Oh, I think we'll kick it over to you. I know I'm noticing a mute.
Technology. It's my first time at this rodeo. Professor Barrett Paul, would you go next?
Sure thing. I think along with Lauren, I'm going to have to engage in some civil disobedience here and not identify one issue. And I think her comment that thinking about this in those terms will actually lead us in the wrong direction. It is a hugely complex problem we face, which is to say the unintended side effects of this technology that now is so influential for the vast majority of our society. In light of that, I'll bring your attention to a couple of things that I think people are not talking about very much without labeling them the most urgent issues. The first of these is economics. The economics of Silicon Valley has changed radically over the last 8, 10, 12 months. An industry which was used to a combination of basically free money in the form of rock bottom interest rates and a generally healthy economy is now grappling with a possible recession and rising of interest rates. And you're seeing company after company in that area laying off thousands and thousands of workers. Why is this relevant to religion, hate, and so forth? It's relevant because I fear that among the first corporate functions to suffer in this environment will be content moderation operations and general policymaking and enforcement concerns that are the best hope, actually, for the form of self-regulation that we need in this industry. So to stop anti-Semitism on Twitter, you need people within Twitter who are paying attention to anti-Semitism. But one of the first things that Elon Musk did upon taking over was more or less fire all the people paying attention to these issues, not just anti-Semitism, but making decisions about what material should be on the site and what material should not be on the site or should be demoted on the site. Similarly, my impression is that based on conversations with people at Meta that I've had recently, that the focus from the CEO and founder of the company on down that was really prominently described circa 2017, 2018 into 2019 has now largely disappeared. And now the entire organization, Meta, tens of thousands of people, first of all, people are worried about the person who used to sit next to them who's now been laid off. But the focus to issues of security, safety, content moderation on the site has largely evaporated at the top, and that at an organization that's very heavily influenced by what the leader says trickles down through the system and will have, I think, very deleterious effects on the rest of that very influential company. So maybe I'll leave it at that because I'm a big believer in short remarks and lots of Q&A, but focus on the economics. We're dealing with a different industry today than the industry we were dealing with just a year ago.
Both immensely interesting opening comments. Zaki, can you take it next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And I also wanted to echo my appreciation and gratitude for being invited to this space. I'm a big fan of Interfaith Alliance, big fan of Reverend Paul and his predecessor. And, I really, as you may have heard from my, bio, this set of issues is really at the core of what I believe in and what I'd like to work on. Just to kind of piggyback real quickly off of the other Paul's remarks in terms of the economic drivers behind a lot of the problems that we're seeing now. There's an article that came out in Wired, I think just 2 days ago, with with a new concept being proposed that perhaps is not the most savory for faithful people, but the word that they used, if you'll forgive me, is called the inshittification of online platforms. In other words, the process by which social media platforms are becoming more and more shitty, so to speak. And again, apologies for the profanity. But the author posed, this is exactly how digital platforms die, which is first, digital platforms are good to their users. Then they abuse their users to make things better for their business customers. Finally, they abuse those business customers to claw back all the value for themselves. And then finally, they die. These are the economics behind how social media platforms work, and they are the reason why there's economic incentive to amplify, spread, and pour fuel on the gasoline of hateful speech and fire. And the last thing I'll say is, for me, just kind of at a macro level, the overarching issue is that we are experiencing a period of explosive innovation and advancement, especially when it comes to AI-driven technology. The problem is that those responsible for building that future are a tiny select few. And so the innovation that we're seeing really only fully serves a tiny select few, with the most marginalized populations getting even more marginalized with every new advancement. In other words, unless things change drastically, the future that is being decided today will not serve all communities because it is not being built by or with all communities. So even if tech companies wanted to do more to confront the spread of hate, and I have my doubts, they're extremely ill-equipped right now to deal with it comprehensively because they have not empowered the most directly affected communities at every step of the product design process. And as Paul said, in fact, they're actually shrinking those teams, they're shrinking those efforts to actually include those communities in the design of products. And in other cases, they're actually exploiting communities of color. Another article just came out that said, chatbot GPT, which everyone is a fan of using now for all sorts of different purposes, that OpenAI, the company that makes chatbot GPT, was actually using Kenyan workers, was paying Kenyan workers less than $2 an hour to actually do the content moderation policies to make ChatGPT less toxic. So they were paying below minimum wage African workers to do the job of making that platform more safe. That is not a sustainable, equitable, or justice-oriented model for confronting hate. So I'll leave it at that, but just wanted to say, kind of the fundamental thing behind all of this is the communities themselves are not part of the design process. They're not part of building our future, and that's why the future that's being built is looking more dystopian than utopian.
Thank you so much. I want to just bring in religion here. This is like a main lens for me. I understand that it might not be the primary lens for everyone on the panel, but I think it's important to talk a little bit about the experience of hate of religious communities or religious individuals and the communities, and how that is directly linked to what you've already been talking about. So does anybody want to address that, talk about the specifics of religion and religious lived experience online?
I'm happy to jump in first and talk a little bit about some of the research that ADL has found when it specifically relates to online harassment in religious communities. Generally speaking, to step back for a moment, we conduct a yearly survey regarding the experiences of Americans as it relates to online hate and harassment. And the trends are unsurprising that individuals are harassed online at alarming rates. But more specifically, individuals are harassed because of their identity characteristics. And just a few statistics that focus specifically on religion. 78% of Muslim respondents this year for our 2022 survey, because that's the most recent data, and 68% of Jewish respondents who experienced harassment attributed that harassment to their identity characteristics. And 44% of all respondents who were harassed due to their religion were worried about future harassment. I think that these high numbers really illustrate the unique and problematic characteristics of harassment and hate online when it comes to religion, which is that this is not only about the individual, but it's about the community generally. It's a message that's being sent, and that spike in fear for future harassment, whether online or offline, runs through conversations, runs through fear during worship, runs through fear in community conversations. We saw, of course, spikes in Zoom bombings during religious high holidays for all of the major religions, and hate speech in chats during those live streams. And unfortunately, we're not seeing any sort of curtailment or responsibility being taken, by the platforms, or meaningful responsibility. As Paul mentioned about Twitter, ADL did a little investigation in the 2 weeks before Elon Musk started and the 2 weeks after Elon Musk started as CEO of Twitter, and found a 61% spike in anti-Semitic tweets referencing Jews or Judaism. We would have no doubt that those statistics align with other religious minority groups, with other marginalized and vulnerable populations generally, but those are the statistics we have. So, why is this so important? It's a reflection of the larger issues, but really it's about communities when it comes to the hate and intimidation that people face when their religious identities are attacked online.
And if I can jump in, I think that, first of all, I think ADL is doing some of the best work possible on the spread of online hate, and especially how it translates from online hate to real world violence and hate crimes against communities. I would also just say that we talk often about the intersectionality of identities of marginalized communities. There's also a lot of intersectionality among the people who are doing the hate themselves. In other words, if you are somebody who is anti-Semitic, especially if you're a white Christian nationalist, you're also more likely to be Islamophobic. You're also more likely to be racist and anti-Black. And so there's an intersection of hate there that I think is very important to keep track of, and not to view these things as in isolation, because chances are, the same group that's being hateful and spreading these messages does it across groups. There's also, I think, what's just as disturbing is the exchanging of ideas and tactics between hate groups, both within the US, but also internationally. In India, there is an explosion of Hindu nationalist rhetoric targeting Muslim minority populations in India and Kashmir especially, also Christian minority populations. And a lot of the tactics that they use to spread hate speech and viral video and speech, they explicitly adapt from white nationalists and white supremacists in the US. So there's this exchanging of ideas of how to spread hate and tactics that's honestly, it's amazing to watch, but also so frightening, because, hate speech and hate movements are not being contained by, borders, by individual country borders. And so I think both of those aspects are important to keep in mind when we talk about faith communities in particular.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to weigh in on this one, or?
Sure. Yeah, Zaki touched on what I think is a very important point, which is to say our field of vision should be broader than the United States or North America. In fact, if you were looking for volume of religion-related oppression online, you would go outside the United States. We live in a paradise by comparison to India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and a number of other countries where online discourse is really poisoned by a combination of religious and ethnic animosity. And these are places, frankly, where the platforms, to the degree that they pay attention to these issues, have paid the least attention. So you've got the worst problem, the least understanding and oversight in terms of people devoted to moderation, enforcement, people who speak the languages, understand the cultures, and so forth. I want to add another point, which is, we have a whole other category of problems on fringe sites. For understandable reasons, we focus a lot of attention on the more or less mainstream sites, entities that outsiders, advocates, and others can have a civil conversation with. But no one is listening to this panel today over at Gab or 4chan and saying, you're right. We got to drop all this bad stuff we do. And the policies aren't there, so the enforcement is not there. The whole point of the site is to gather and spread hate. In the United States, there is not much we can do about that. The First Amendment prevents the government from stepping in and setting policies, let alone making enforcement decisions for these sites. Unless people are threatening to gather and commit imminent violence, there's not a lot that outsiders can do. But we can be aware of it. We can be aware of when ideas germinated on those sites make the leap into the mainstream, and we can pay attention to it and bring to public attention what is going on there, because a lot of the extremism much of which had racial and religious overtones that led, for example, to January 6th was what percolated initially on a combination of fringe sites and mainstream sites, and then the actual organizing was often done in those same venues. So all of us need to pay attention to this, do what we can to bring sunlight to it, while law enforcement people do the very limited amount of things they can do when actual violence is threatened.
And
you started. Go ahead, Lauren.
Would you mind? Thank you. So just to jump in there and to build on what Paul just said, which is, the ping ponging also between these darker or more fringe platforms to mainstream platforms is one of the core motivators behind the normalization of extremism, of white supremacy. And one, body of platforms that I want to bring up too is the online multiplayer game space. There's been a lot of attention paid to online multiplayer games as media, but these are digital social spaces where millions of Americans, adults and youth especially, are engaging in conversation. We have pretty alarming statistics. Of course, that's where a lot of our work lies. 20% of adults were exposed to white supremacist ideologies in online multiplayer games in 2022. 15% of youth ages 10 to 17. So these conversations are proliferating in the dark web. They're proliferating in online multiplayer game spaces. They're proliferating on mainstream social media platforms. And that thread is what's really causing the normalization and this invitation to engage in online and offline violence.
Not just gaming proper, but the gaming adjacent platforms, some of which are now, supersized social media platforms in and of themselves, like Discord and Twitch, which spin out of the gaming world, but now you have a lot of gamers there, but a lot of other people too, and you can go on Discord and join a private server and be anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim, to your heart's content, and the outside world will not be watching. So it's a fast evolving environment.
This is, I think, extraordinarily helpful. Just the naming of it. I think naming it is really helpful. And so, but I want to kind of push us one step further. There's the naming of it, but what are the resources that people like the people on this panel and those of us those who are listening to us, who are committed to a truly peaceful and pluralistic, respectful society, what tools do we have at this point in order to begin to stem this tide or reverse it? Where do you place your, I know I keep on saying greatest hope, but I know it's going to be holistic, so I'm happy with that too. Where do you place your hope? Zaki, when you at Aspen Digital, where do you try to, if you want people to really focus on a thing, where do you want to focus them?
That's a big question, and if I figure that out, I probably would be out of a job, because my livelihood depends on finding more problems to solve. So my job at Aspen Digital is to look at the intersection of tech and marginalized communities. I think what I said in the opening, to me, is the fundamental problem. It's the lack of meaningful inclusion of marginalized communities at every step of the design and implementation of emerging technologies. A lot of companies have really good DEI programs, and they've got good communications and marketing teams that can engage with communities after the fact, but there is really no concerted effort to bring in these voices at the earliest stage of product design. And that might seem like a kind of dry area to focus on, but to me, it's actually everything. Because the questions that come up here are like, who defines hate? Who defines bad content and good content? What is actually offensive and hateful towards a particular community? oftentimes only that community can tell you. And if you're not doing a good enough job of including them in the development of these tools and platforms, even unintentionally, you're going to give rise to the spread of hateful and especially uniquely targeted content against those communities. So to me, that's the most urgent thing, is to radically reshape the way tech companies do product design. There are some companies that are starting to lead a little bit more in this space. Meta, for example, has created a product equity team or inclusive product design team. Again, with all the layoffs that have been happening, who knows how long a team like that is going to last at Meta. But there's certainly a desire to move more in that direction. I think the problem, like I said, is that as we often have heard companies talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion from purely an HR perspective. Like, how do we hire more brown people, essentially, is what they ask themselves. That's the wrong question at this point. The question at this point is, how do you include communities in the fundamental design of your products and platforms? And that takes something much broader than just an HR approach. And I think that if we can solve that part, it's not going to fix the problem. It's not going to stop the spread of hate, but it's certainly going to enhance the tools that we use to confront the spread of hate.
Lauren, Paul, where do you play? We all have limited resources and a limited ability to focus our organizations. Where are you focused right now as far as responding to some of what we've been talking about?
Lauren, if you want to go first.
Sure, no problem. I think twofold. There's a myriad of things we need to focus on, but I'll highlight two right now. First is building on what Zaki mentioned, which is this diversification of who is building our products, who is creating these spaces, and is there a sense of anti-hate or equity by design, just as we've seen a swing towards privacy by design in building. Certainly not sufficient enough by any means, but the design feature is important. I'll mention that last year, ADL engaged in building an online hate classifier, an anti-Semitism classifier, by using both experts and targets of anti-Semitism to help fuel the AI and machine learning techniques that drove this classifier and that created and allowed us to stand up this classifier. If a small nonprofit can do that, certainly these billion and trillion dollar companies can do better and do more to include a diversified workforce and also communities to help build their products. Important and robust policies are crucial. Paul mentioned the disbanding of a lot of trust and safety personnel at the major tech companies. That's a huge issue. So it's the combination of policy and enforcement. But at the end of the day, I think a focus that we cannot look away from, and I know this has been mentioned on the panel, prior to my bringing it up, is the fact that the business model currently underpins and supports the proliferation of a lot of the content that we see. We're living in an online world that optimizes for engagement, and often the most corrosive or hateful content is the most engaging content, and that is what creates a system where platforms can take our behavioral data and then use that to put more and more and deeply engaging content, whether or not it is problematic, violent, hateful, and then also service advertisements, because we truly are the product when it comes to these platforms. So that business model and that incentive structure has to change, because it is really the foundational underpinnings of the content that we see.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, well, good luck changing the basic business model. There's no obvious way to do that from the outside, and as long as the business model pays, even if the boom in Silicon Valley has in some ways plateaued, certainly for companies like Meta, where they see their Facebook platform, its growth has leveled off and actually begun to erode. I don't see Mark Zuckerberg surrendering the advertising and engagement-driven model anytime soon, and it's very likely that what they're trying to do is figure out how to do that same model in the new world that they're imagining, the so-called metaverse of 3D immersive technology. All that said, I think about this question in in two pieces: one, self-regulation; the other, government regulation. Because we're talking about an expressive industry that enjoys itself a good degree of First Amendment protection, it is not a simple thing for government, any extension of government, to tell these companies what to do, because they're in the business of speech, and specifically conveying the speech of other people. But nevertheless, their choices of what they choose to put on their platforms is expressive conduct or editorial control, pulling language from various past Supreme Court cases. In light of that, we have to do what my colleagues have said. Private individuals, civic society groups, advocacy groups have to figure out ways to bring pressure to bear on these companies, to bring light to what they're doing, and frankly, to put pressure on them, to embarrass them for the things that they're not doing that they should be doing, and hope that through that process, there will be incremental change. There has been incremental change. I mean, content moderation was not taken at all seriously at these companies before the 2016 presidential election debacle. It was only after then, beginning in 2017, that the companies even would talk about that issue publicly, let alone devote resources to it. So things have changed, but not enough. The other piece of the answer, I think, is government regulation. Again, it's going to necessarily be limited because of the wise restriction contained in the First Amendment on government interfering with the speech of private entities, including these companies. That said, there are mechanisms for doing this. My center has done research on and has produced some writing on the idea of using the Consumer Protection Authority of the Federal Trade Commission to enhance the oversight of social media companies. Right now, social media companies are an anomaly. Unlike other industries, this industry is just not regulated in any way by the federal government. There's no SEC overseeing equity markets or FCC overseeing radio and cable and so forth. It's not easy to cure that problem. It would take very judicious legislation, but some of that legislation has begun to be introduced. And sadly, we're going to see that go sort of into remission or be ignored in the next 2 years, at least, because of the Republican takeover of the House. But the concept of consumer protection, where you hold companies to fulfill the promises that they've made to consumers in a commercial context, is admittedly a limited field, but is one where the FTC has regulated companies in other industries and forced them to fulfill the promises that they've made. In this case, it would be promises that are made, for example, in terms of service or in the publication of community standards. And I can go on in more detail if anyone's interested. And I can also put in the chat a link to a paper that I've written on this idea about the FTC. But that's one promising limited area where the government could do some good if we could get political consensus in Washington.
If I could just add one more thing real quick, I'm always hesitant to place the burden of responsibility on the community that it is itself being marginalized. But at the same time, I think just as much as it's incumbent upon tech companies to embed the community perspectives much more thoroughly and comprehensively, I think there's also a gap here where community leaders, like let's take faith leaders, for example, who might be on this webinar, you all understand your congregations, your communities, you understand the impact that hate has on your communities, but you're not necessarily conversant in the minutia of how these platforms actually work. And that becomes a problem when we do have advocacy meetings where groups meet with tech companies, but don't quite understand how to articulate the harm that's being done. It gives the tech companies an out to be able to say like, well, they didn't really tell us how to fix the problem, so we're just not going to address it. So one thing that we're working on at Aspen Digital is to create a program that provides basically a boot camp of how these emerging technology platforms are working, and have that boot camp geared specifically towards community leaders, faith leaders, and civil rights leaders, so that they understand and can become conversant in these issues, so that when they do go toe-to-toe with tech companies, it's a more even playing field, and that the power balance is no longer totally lopsided. And so I think that is especially needed, is for community leaders themselves to understand how these platforms work, so they can more effectively advocate on behalf of their communities.
I
And
love that. And I want to, Lauren, go ahead. I just want to say, I love that. And I do hope that we can partner with you on getting the word out about that, because I think that's really, really important. Lauren, go ahead.
absolutely. And I do too. I think congratulations on that work. It's incredibly important. I do want to quickly address the business model discussion, because I do think, and call me an optimist, I think that's probably why I'm doing this work. But I think that there are moves that can be made, increased consumer protection, regulations, increased transparency to be able to look under the hood and understand how platform products and policies are operated and being enforced, considering increased privacy protections, relooking at the behavioral advertising model and what is and isn't able to be done. I know that there's deep and heated discussions regarding Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and platforms immunity from liability, antitrust issues. We just saw the Department of Justice sue Google yesterday, I think, amongst many times prior to that. And so I do think there is no one single fix that's going to change the environment today, but I absolutely agree. Certainly self-regulation, certainly communities, but also government regulation. Government does have levers that they can pull on, both here at home and also internationally.
Yeah, I want to say that I do think that the religious communities, in my experience, have kind of dropped the ball on this. And, I'm not trying to blame the victims, but I am saying that, I often have asked like big rooms of religious leaders, when was the last time you preached on the internet about what's happening there, about what it really means, what it really is? And they never do. The only thing they say is, well, time to sign off, take a day of sabbatical. That's not going to cure it. And we need to be actually very leaned in. And this is something where, when the Gutenberg press came out, the religion was right in the middle of it, and they had a very clear understanding of their mandate. Right now, religious communities have no understanding of their mandate, and it's happening to them rather than being leaned in and asking the question, like, how can we help shape this? How can we be trained in disrupting hate? How can we be online, and how can we figure out to be better citizens online? I do think that there's an opportunity there. So I really appreciate that. We're about to get into questions, but the question of there are court cases in front of the Supreme Court, and I'm just wondering, are any of you like, is there a there, or is this just to get to the Supreme Court, there must be some there, but do you feel like anything good can happen there?
I'd be happy to step in there. Yeah, there basically, there's a case that the court has agreed to decide this term called Gonzalez versus Google. And then there are a pair of cases which are out on the horizon concerning the laws that have been passed in Texas and Florida that would restrict the type of content moderation that large platforms can undertake. And the Supreme Court just this week basically postponed any decision-making on the latter, the state law case, by asking the Solicitor General's office and the Justice Department for its view on that matter. So that's all going to get pushed off until the Supreme Court's next term. The case pending at the moment is basically about the scope of Section 230, which is a federal statute that was enacted in 1996 and which protects basically interactive internet companies, which includes social media companies, protects them from lawsuits that point to, as the source of harm, content that has been posted on the platform by a third party. This has been a huge boon to this industry. It allowed companies like then Facebook, now Meta, YouTube, now part of Google, to get off the ground in the 2000s without having to worry about being, sued until the cows come home. And it undergirds the whole basic structure of social media, which is to say, businesses that use somebody else's content contributed by users and manages to figure out a way to sell advertising against that free content to make a lot of money. And the question is to what degree should those companies today be shielded from lawsuits that say, hey, that piece of content on your platform is dangerous. It's harmed me. The case before the Supreme Court was brought initially by relatives of a woman who very sadly was killed in 2015 in an act of terrorism by the Islamic State in Paris, part of a huge massacre in which I think something like 129 people died. This woman's relatives are upset because YouTube, part of Google, carried videos that had been uploaded by Islamic State. And they're saying we should be able to blame YouTube, not just Islamic State, but YouTube, and get to its deep pockets because you hosted and recommended this content.
Yeah.
And I'll just quickly add in, thank you for that, Paula, that these cases have the potential to have a huge impact on the landscape. Specifically in Gonzalez versus Google, ADL filed an amicus brief in support of neither party, discussing this really important issue because of the sort of broad question before the court. We argue that there's two main provisions in Section 230, one which provides an immunity from liability and one which empowers platforms to engage in content moderation. And we argue that the immunity from liability provision has been over broadly interpreted, and that the need for platforms to be able to feel empowered to moderate their platforms and to create communities that are in line with their values is incredibly important and should remain as is. It's a complicated line to walk, but it's an important one. And Section 230, which does, just like Paul mentioned, completely underpin the way that our internet works today. It was passed in 1996. And so the internet does look quite different now than it did then. And yet we want to be able to have robust and free discussion. So that line has to be walked. We believe Section 230 should be updated, but it needs to be done at the risk of sounding cheesy, with a scalpel and not with a sledgehammer. So that's, these questions, we're really curious. The oral argument, I believe, is going to be heard in mid-February. So we're going to be watching very closely. And then the cases that Paul mentioned, the state law cases taking on the Section 230 issue, will be kicked until likely 2024.
Thank you so much. I think
I should add, in the interest of just full disclosure, our center at NYU filed an amicus brief as well. We supported Google in this case because the exception that the petitioners are asking for recommendations, we fear actually could turn out to be much broader and could basically eviscerate the law and sweep away a huge amount of free speech online. And there may well be changes that need to be made with 230. In fact, we have supported such changes, but that should be done across the street from the court by the Congress.
Thank you. I want to get to a couple questions that have come in. One is just really practical. Aside from quitting Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other social media, what are the best ways for everyday people or religious leaders or everyday religious folks to pressure social media companies to be more responsible?
Well, I keep tweeting at Elon Musk, but he doesn't answer.
It's just what should people do? I mean, is it just really as simple as quitting, or are there, I can't quit. I mean, I can't quit.
Yeah.
That's not really an option in front of me for my work. But what are ways that we can make our voices heard?
I'd love to hear from the other panelists, but I'll quickly mention, I think we have to think about this in both a micro and a macro fashion. At a micro level, the increased conversations that Zaki and Paul were both mentioning, but also conversations really with our youth, being interested in how they're engaging online, not just saying, oh, that's too complicated, or what I'm going to bring up online multiplayer games again. What are they even doing? Having really open, authentic, and curious conversations with people offline about their online behavior and about what's going on is really important. I think that increased education that Aspen Institute is doing is so important, because people need to understand the impact of what they're doing. The fact that if somebody is liking or retweeting something, even in rage, even in vehement disagreement, that's actually fueling the conversation. It's allowing platforms to profit off of that content, and it's normalizing it. So knowing about our digital hygiene, helping and having conversations with our youth, that's the micro piece. And I know that there's more to it than that. And then at the macro level, folks can get engaged. Advocacy organizations like ADL and the great work of Stern and of Aspen, we're doing stuff, and we want to be able to engage with concerned stakeholders and community members. So, whether that's talking to our lawmakers, whether that's talking to industry, doing it in partnership at that macro level, really, like I said, I'm an optimist here. It really can help us move the needle. Maybe not as fast as we'd like, but absolutely it's a necessary conversation.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that at both the micro and macro level and everything in between. I think education is the key point, for us as individuals to understand not just the content that's out there, but how it gets distributed, what the incentive structures are. Us just becoming more knowledgeable about how the system itself works empowers us to do better advocacy. And so at the micro level, as an individual, you should understand that, and you should also be able to then, understand better what your family's doing, what your children are doing, as Lauren is saying. And at the community level, I think Reverend Paul, you mentioned, we should be smarter about this, especially when it comes to like our houses of worship. I'll just speak from my own faith tradition. Most of the times when the internet is mentioned in a Friday sermon at a mosque, it's about like the immoralities that exist on the internet, and that's about it. There's not a lot of talk about, the threats, the violence, the hate, and how they directly affect us. And to Lauren's point, we have another program at Aspen Digital where we look at the intersection of youth and technology. And one of the biggest things that we're hearing is youth don't like the patronizing attitude that we tend to take when it comes to online protections, because those tend to look like keep kids off the internet and that's it. And that's not a sustainable model, right? We have to understand we have to take a rights-based approach to how we protect kids and how we protect everybody online. And the onus is not on kids or parents to keep them away from harmful content. The onus is upon those who are building the internet and building these platforms to build them in ways that are truly value the rights of its users more than it does the financial bottom line. So I think that, again, education on all these topics is the most important thing from the micro level all the way to the macro level. I would encourage every major, faith organization or civil rights group to really read up on all of these emerging technologies, to become conversant in it before you engage in advocacy, just so that when you do engage in advocacy, you do so from a place of knowledge and impact. That's something that I cannot stress enough. I've been in many spaces where a variety of faith leaders come together to bash Facebook, but they do it in a way that is so imprecise that ultimately it does not lead to any kind of actionable change. And again, in fact, it just gives an excuse for those companies to be like, well, they don't really know what they're saying, so there's nothing for me to act upon. So that's where I'll leave it.
If people are interested in, educating particularly younger people, there is a part of the world where online literacy is part of elementary school education and on up from there. Scandinavian countries have done this for some years. There's been some social science on it, and it's been found to be somewhat effective. Scandinavian countries are a lot more homogeneous than the United States is, but nevertheless, that's the one place where this has been tried out systematically. So if literacy education sounds appealing, people should look at some of that research.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And actually, another question was about protecting youth. And I think we assume because young people are young, that they understand the internet. And I don't think anybody, understanding the internet is hard. Understanding the water into which you're jumping, and you think, oh, that was made for me. Well, no, it wasn't made for you. Actually, it was made for you as a consumer, but it's not made for you. So understanding into the, these can be life-giving or dangerous waters, and we have to let people know what they're jumping into. Okay, this is, I know that Paul's going to really be like, don't do this, but I'm going to do it. Is there a quick answer, because we're about to stop, is what gives you hope right now? Where do you, I love that you've said you're an optimist, Lauren. Let's start with you. What gives you hope? And again, we have like not a lot of time to answer this, but I'd love to hear it.
I mean, we're having this conversation, and more we're seeing this conversation at all levels, not just with, folks that are deeply entrenched in the technology policy space, and not just with industry folks. I think that is hugely important. It's showing that we're getting smarter as a community and that we're not going to put up with the status quo. And so that gives me hope. I think that I also hope to see increased self and government regulation because I think that we need it. But these conversations are truly, heartening and inspiring to me to continue the work that we're all doing.
Okay, Paul.
What gives me hope is that after a very sustained online, mostly social media related campaign to continue to amplify election denialism, the forces of darkness were pushed back in our recent midterm elections, and people actually woke up, got off the couch, and voted for candidates who were not claiming that all elections in the United States are rigged. That's a significant event, and we have to do again what was done in the lead up to the midterms, which is to say, put a lot of attention on these ideas and how they spread. I think it had an effect, and I think the Senate remains in Democratic hands, and the Republican control of the House is tenuous as a result of that. That's a concrete accomplishment.
Zaki.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything gives me hope, maybe it's cliche, but it's the youth of our generation. I think that Gen Z, I'm a, dignified elderly millennial, and
Get out of here.
I think Gen Z really, the ways in which they're engaging with the technology. I mean, yeah, there's a lot more harms than there ever have been before, but also this generation is so much more savvy and understanding and empathetic in ways that they've never been before, and they understand things like intersectionality so much more intrinsically than I think even my generation did. They understand that if you're experiencing hate because of one community that you come from, chances are there's other folks just like you from other communities that are also experiencing that same hate from the same nexus, and they're coming up with tools themselves to confront that hate together, and that makes me feel really good. I mean, I think that we were talking about Discord earlier. Discord for certain, provides spaces for hateful folks to gather. It also provides a great space for people that are working on social justice issues and confronting hate. Discord has a very interesting community policy in their approach to how they do content moderation. It's a lot more what you might consider to be democratic. Sometimes it works super well. And sometimes youth are able to use Discord's very specific community guidelines to really self-regulate, self-moderate in a way that's very healthy. And so, I think young people are truly the ones that understand how to hold power accountable. They understand, they don't take for granted the same old kind of corporate lines that have worked on previous generations. And for that reason, I do continue to have hope in spite of all the dark clouds that seem to be gathering above us.
I appreciate that very much. For Interfaith Alliance, we are interested in framing this issue around hate as partially a religious freedom issue, a freedom of religion to be able to be expressed without intimidation and hate. We think that's an important expansion of why people should be caring about this issue, not necessarily as a legal framework, but as something that really should matter to people as part of our Constitution, as part of what we should all be concerned with. People should not have to be subjected to this hate online. We're going to put the report that we are releasing today in the chat right now, and everyone, we're glad that you will be the first people to be receiving this. We're also hoping that can be a primer. It is a very succinct kind of, a lot of what you've heard today is come ups in that report, and this can be a primer for a conversation, we hope, in your community and where you come from. Let me thank this panel one more time. This was so helpful and exciting, and it gave me hope. So my hope is hearing from people like you and the many others that you represent. Thank you so much to you three and to everyone who showed up today. We really appreciate it. And I hope you have a really wonderful day going forward.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.